Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Pat Higgins. I'm the president and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and it's really lovely to welcome you tonight to our closing program for our current special exhibition, Hidden History, Recounting the Shanghai Jewish Story. I'd like to start by extending a special thank you to our exhibition sponsors. Hidden History was created by Holocaust Museum Los Angeles and made possible by East West Bank Foundation. We're excited to be the first host of this fantastic traveling exhibition, and it's always wonderful to work with our peer museums. Our presenting sponsor is Texas Instruments, whose support enabled us to bring this exhibition to Dallas, and we are incredibly grateful for their support. Hidden History is also generously supported by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, the Jean-Baptiste Tad Adui III Fund of the Dallas Foundation, and the Texas Holocaust, Genocide, and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission. Our partner sponsors are American Airlines, Bank of Texas, Dallas Tourism Public Improvement District, Debbie and Ron Green, the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, and NFI Industries, and additional support has been provided by Marcia Gasworth and Larry Ginsberg. It takes many, many people to make it possible for us to have an exhibition like this, so please help me thank them. I'd also like to thank our wonderful exhibition community partners. And it's a long list, so bear with me. The Aaron Family Jewish Community Center, the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies at UTD, AJC Dallas, Beth El Binah, Center for Asian Studies at UTD, Congregation Beth Torah, Congregation Nishmat Am, Congregation Shereth Israel, Dallas Chinese Community Center, Dallas Jewish Historical Society, the Orchid Giving Circle, Southwest Jewish Congress, Temple Emmanuel, and Temple Shalom. We are so thankful for our sponsors and our community partners who helped us get the word out about this exhibition. It's been really fun working with all of them, and we're very grateful. I'd also like to give a special welcome to our board members, our museum members, volunteers, and generations members who are with us. We couldn't do this work without your support. If you are in the audience and you'd like to get engaged, please become a member, consider becoming a volunteer. We really have a wonderful volunteer and member family, and we would really appreciate your support. So now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Manny Gabler, our featured speaker. Manny was born in Milan, Italy, in 1938, after his parents fled Nazi Germany. On the eve of World War II, the family was smuggled out of Milan and found refuge in Shanghai, China. In just a minute, he will share his story of survival with us. These past few months, we have been honored to host Hidden History, which explores the little-known history of the diverse resettled Jewish community in Shanghai. If you have not yet seen this exhibition, I encourage you to do so after tonight's program because it closes for good on February 16th. So you can stay tonight or come back, but it will be leaving us soon. After Manny's remarks, we'll have an opportunity for audience questions. So as usual, we have note cards and pencils. Hopefully you picked those up as you were entering. Please write your questions on the note cards and hand them to a volunteer. And for those of you joining us via Zoom, please put your questions into the Q&A button, and we will do our best to answer as many of them as possible. I'd also like to ask you to silence your cell phones and electronic devices so that we can all enjoy Manny's conversation without disruptions. So now I would like to turn things over to our wonderful speaker, Mr. Manny Gabler.
Hi, I'm here to tell you about my experience as a Jewish refugee in World War II, Shanghai, China, and how my family and 18,000 other Jews survived the Holocaust and ended up there. The memories are those of a young boy as I perceived them. I lived in the moment as children do, and didn't realize the horrors of what I saw until later in my life. Unfortunately, both my parents died young from the stress of survival and raising two children in war-torn foreign countries. By the time I was old enough to ask about the past and family history, they were gone. I was an international salesman in 1981, and on a business trip to Europe, I went to the US Embassy in Berlin to request the necessary papers to travel into East Germany. I wanted to find my remaining family in Chemnitz. They were Christian and had survived the war. The consul suggested that I was an American citizen, born in Italy, grew up in China, spoke German, and was Jewish, so the Russians and East Germans might treat me as a spy. He didn't think he could explain who I was, so he could not guarantee my safety. Prudently, I did not go to Chemnitz. Some of the events I learned about later when I found my mother's family in Germany. It wasn't until 2003 when I got a call at my office asking for Manfred Gabler. I go by Manny, so whenever anybody would call for Manfred, we knew it was a sales call and we wouldn't respond to it. But the woman on the other end said, "Don't hang up, I'm not selling anything." She turned out to be Angela Ray, a graduate student at West Virginia University and the granddaughter of my Aunt Ellie, one of my mother's two sisters. For Ellie's 80th birthday, she was given a gift of visiting my mother's grave in Pittsburgh, where we had been living when she was alive. I told her that she was buried in California, so why not come to visit in Minneapolis instead? Ellie, Angela, and her father Jochen came to Minneapolis from Chemnitz in 2003. Ellie was able to look at old photos and give me some insight into the past. We decided to do a family reunion the following year in Chemnitz. In April 2004, my wife Kathy and I, my son Glenn, my brother Ralph and his wife Diane, and Ralph's children went to Chemnitz. The 10 of us and our German family all stayed in a small hotel in Chemnitz. We walked into a private dinner party that evening where I met 40 of my relatives that I had never met before in my life. It still gets to me. What a special moment. Tears flowed from all of us. I had never had a chance to connect with family like this before, and now I understood the joy of it. My parents were Simon and Irmgard. My mother wasn't Jewish, and she converted to Judaism and took the name of Esther when she converted. They were living in Chemnitz in southeast Germany, about 50 kilometers from the Czech border. My father was a champion skier, guitar player, and an amateur boxing weight champion. He was well known throughout Germany. He belonged to a Jewish sports association known as the Maccabees. Because of his fame and his Jewish connection, he was well known to the Nazi Gestapo and was in danger of being arrested. At great personal danger, my parents, Simon and Esther, were married in Chemnitz in 1935. This was illegal because of the Nuremberg laws enacted by the Reichstag on September 15th, 1935, with anti-Semitic and racist laws for the protection of German blood and honor. It forbade the marriages and extramarital intercourse between Jews and Germans. Only those of German blood could be citizens of the Reich. Those that broke the law were sent to prison, and subsequent to 1938, upon completing their sentences, were rearrested and sent to Nazi concentration camps. The law had a devastating economic effect on the Jews. Germans would no longer shop in Jewish-owned businesses, and all the professions, as well as government, civil service, medicine, and education, were closed to the Jews. The Jews had to take menial jobs to survive and had to wear armbands with a yellow Star of David on them, identifying them as non-citizens and someone to hate and avoid. Hitler was blaming all the economic ills of the 30s on the 500,000 Jews out of 67 million Germans. Food and fuel shortages were, of course, the fault of the Jews. The German people bought into this racism and hatred and persecuted even their Jewish neighbors. Children would no longer play with their now forbidden schoolmates. It became okay to beat up the dirty Jews. Before this, the Jews were proud of their contribution to German society. The Nazis saw it differently. They saw the Jews as stealing the sciences, controlling the banking system, newspapers, industries, and medicine. As the situation became more desperate, my father and now pregnant mother decided to flee to Italy in 1937. Fortunately, none of the Christian family turned them into the Gestapo. My mother's pregnant sister, Ellie, who was living in the apartment with my grandparents, was arrested and sent to work in a munitions factory as punishment for not turning in her sister. Aunt Ellie had 2 miscarriages while at hard labor for 2 years. My father had a sister, Ida, who lived in Milan and gave them a connection in Italy. When they arrived in Italy, my father made a living as an ice cream vendor to feed our family. I was born in Milan in 1938 at our apartment on Corso Buenos Aires, 45. I was named Manfred Sigmund from a list of authorized Nazi names. To name me Aaron after my grandfather would bring unneeded attention to us. All my father's family, his father Aaron, mother Anna, and sister Ruth decided to stay in Germany. They were subsequently taken to concentration camps and murdered. All their property was seized when they were taken away. The culmination came on November 9th, 1938, when the horror of Nazism swept over Europe with a campaign of racial discrimination and violence. This was Kristallnacht, or Night of the Broken Glass, on which all the synagogues, their books, their Torahs were burned and Jewish businesses destroyed. The police were ordered to stand by and do nothing while 91 Jews were killed and hundreds more injured. The Jews were ordered to clean up the mess and broken windows while being berated by the mobs that caused the destruction. Kristallnacht was now the moment that defined the doom of the 1,000-year-old community of European Jews. Now that their home was gone forever, they lived in fear and anxiety and now were officially the enemy. The Nazis began systematically rounding them up and sending them to forced labor and death camps like Dachau, Buchenwald, Treblinka, and many more. Little known was that after a Nazi mass deportation plan of the Jews failed, and if one could find a way to leave Germany, the Nazis would let you go. Of course, a difficult task, since 90% tax was levied on any Jews leaving Germany, and all their assets had been lost. Jews also didn't have a valid passport or visa because they were no longer citizens. Some Jews sold everything they owned or had hidden and were able to buy passage and leave. HIAS, the Hebrew Immigration Assistance Society, helped where they could. Those that could get a passport had to leave Germany within 6 months when their passports would expire. They would then be sent to concentration camps and certain death. Unfortunately, there was no place to run to. The Jews became victims of universal immigration restrictions. All the countries around the world, including the United States and Britain, had closed their doors to the Jews who needed a safe haven. For example, it took $400 to go to Australia. and a guarantee of 2 years' income to go to the US, even if permitted a princely sum at the time. Miraculously, an opportunity arose, Shanghai. Once Germany and Italy became allied, the Nazis moved in and took over Italy. They sequestered the Italian dictator Mussolini in a villa with his mistress. Now the Gestapo, Geheime Staatspolizei in German, or secret state police, controlled Italy too. Their quest for the solution of the Jewish problem was in full swing, and they were again searching for Jews to arrest and send to a concentration camp. My cousin Joe, Aunt Ida's son, was taken from the home of his babysitter and sent to a camp in Germany at age 5. He survived there for the next 5 years. Ida had a friend who knew a Catholic bishop, and through him got Joe out of the camp. The bishop sent 2 men to the camp with papers saying he was Joe, a Catholic named Carlo Antonio, and had been arrested by mistake. He was taken to a monastery where he was baptized and lived out the war. With the help of anti-German Italian partisans and money from Hayes, we were smuggled to Genoa on the coast, where we got on an Italian cruise ship, the Conte Verde. We then sailed 8,000 miles through the Suez Canal around India to the coast of China. We sailed up the Yangtze River to the Hongkew River to a dock in the international settlement owned by the British. The luxurious Italian cruise ship was in stark contrast to the Shanghai they would land in. A little bit of history to explain the international settlement. In the early 1800s, the British were buying silks and teas from China, but they had nothing to sell the Chinese in return, causing a trade deficit. Since the British Empire included India, they now used those lands to grow poppies for the production of opium to export to China. Only the wealthy could afford to buy the opium, and the merchants became addicted. The Chinese revolted with the Opium Wars of the 1840s, but their square-sailed wooden boats called sampans could not defeat the British Navy frigates. The Chinese were now forced to open 5 ports to trade with the West, Shanghai being the largest one. The British set themselves up with favored nation status and set up their areas in Shanghai with its own laws and controls called the International Settlement. Even the Chinese were not welcome in the British area. The French did the same and called their area the French Concession to get their piece of trade and control. The Chinese became second-class citizens in their own country. Shanghai became the commercial center of China. You've probably seen evidence of this in pictures of the Bund, a strip along the Hongkew River filled with European architecture representing European businesses, banks, restaurants, residences, and hotels. In 1937, the Japanese captured large portions of China, Shanghai included, but the British and the French were still allowed to control their areas and controlled commerce. The British, French, and the Japanese didn't want to be involved in immigration and passport control. Even though the Japanese were allied with the Nazis, they would let the refugee ships into the harbor. The docks were in the Japanese-controlled Hongkew area just west of the international settlement, so the Jewish refugees arriving almost daily could simply get off the ships without a passport or travel papers. They landed mostly in 1939 and 40 and settled in Hongkew for the cheap rent and food. The poorest part of Shanghai, badly battered by the war with the Japanese, and within the international settlement, known as the Wayside Police District, It was home to the poorest Chinese and occupying Japanese. The refugees were ill-fitted for Shanghai. Clothing of mild winters and summers had no place in the heat and humidity, as well as the cold, wet winters. More than half were over 40, white-collar workers who were in their professions for 15 years in Europe and didn't speak the English, the business language of Shanghai. They came to political necessity, not economic reasons. Hongkew was like nothing the European Jews had ever seen before. Crowded, very dirty, smelly, hot and humid. It was scary to land in a city with no means to support themselves, did not speak the language, and had no prospects for employment. Shanghai was not ready for the influx of thousands of them, and the refugees were not prepared to spend the next 10 years in China. The Japanese wanted to get along with the Jews, as they felt that after they won the war, they would have to do business with them and could use them to negotiate with the West on their behalf. Fortunately, there were some wealthy Sephardic Jewish merchants, resident British citizens, who had come to China in the 1800s from Baghdad, Iraq. These were the Sassoons and the Kaduris, and enormously wealthy families who bought shattered buildings in the Hongkew area and quickly rebuilt them into bunkhouses, euphemistically called Heime, German for homes, for lack of a better word, with 15 to 150 people per room in rows and rows of steel bunk beds, a soup kitchen, barely usable toilet facilities, and a few baths. They sent flatbed trucks to the docks to take the refugees to Hongkew. The men slept in one room and the women and children in another. At that time, 5 cents would feed a refugee for a day. Since we had no clothes other than what we came with, we wore the same clothes every day or hand-me-downs from other children. I directly remember the chicken wire embedded in the factory windows. In the summer, all the steel beds were taken outside and placed in a huge pile and set on fire to kill the lice. This huge fire was a treat for all the kids to watch. Conditions were terrible. Shanghai was rife with every disease known to mankind. The water was polluted and had to be boiled. Since there was little in the way of sanitary facilities, men called potmen would come daily with hand-drawn carts to empty the sewage from the wooden buckets we used daily. That became the fertilizer they sold for the vegetable fields. In the summer, it could be 140 degrees in the shade by today's heat index, and cold and wet in the winter. It didn't really get below freezing often, but because of the humidity, it was very cold. We had no heat and slept in our clothes to keep warm. The water table was 6 feet down, so when it rained, the water had no place to go, and the Hongkew River would overflow and flood the streets with everything imaginable floating in the water. I would walk to school in rubber boots through the flooded streets. The local drinking fountain was a wooden barrel on legs in the street corner, filled with tea and a bamboo dipper to drink from. My mother was apoplectic when she found out I had been drinking from it. Hongkew, now the Jewish ghetto, housed all 18,000 of us crowded in 1 square mile, about 8 blocks by 8 blocks. The Chinese surrounding us were even worse off than we were. If one of the Chinese children died from the cold or disease, they would wrap them in a straw mat or newspapers, lay them out on the sidewalk, and a garbage truck would come in the morning and take the bundles away with all the other corpses of beggars that froze to death, an average of 80 a day. I walked past those bundles on the way to school. Eventually, some of the better off Jews moved from the Hongkew to rooms in the French concessions, leaving about 9,000 living in the ghetto. Even some of that lived outside Hongkew would still spend hours in line to get a meal. The Japanese were very cruel to the Japanese. One of my friends saw a Chinese man stealing a canister of kerosene from the Japanese, and they tied his hands together and shot them off. It wasn't until years later when I realized the horrors of what I saw as a child. I thought it was part of the landscape. In 1940, my brother Ralph was born in the midst of all this poverty. Soon the local charity was overwhelmed when the influx of Jews swelled to over 18,000. The Joint Distribution Committee, a collection of Jewish charities based in New York, stepped up to help. They sent Laura Margolis, a professional social worker from Baltimore, to coordinate the poorly managed relief effort. Thanks to that effort, the refugees remained at least sheltered and barely fed until 1941. When the incredible perseverance, the Jews built a community, stores, restaurants, bakeries, coffee shops, doctor's office, theaters opened, 3 newspapers in Yiddish and German were being printed. Musicians were entertaining in dance halls. One man sold cook time for the women to buy an hour and cook a pot of food if they could get some to cook. This became a gathering place for the women and gave them some social connection. Some of the refugees managed to get jobs outside the Hongkew based on their skills. My father was a mechanic and worked at China Fiber Company to repair their trucks and factory equipment, earning $3 per month, barely enough to support us. We children went to a Cambridge curriculum school built by Horace Kaduri, and it was a typical school with a large soccer field in the middle and spacious single-floor classrooms around it. We managed to get a great education. We spoke German at home, English with a British accent in school, and minimal Chinese on the street. We played with Chinese children who accepted us with tolerance and no anti-Semitism. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the British, French, and Americans were now the enemy too. The Japanese controlled all of Shanghai and moved the British and the French into internment camps across the Huangpu River, across from Shanghai. All the Allied nationals had to wear red armbands. The British connecting Hongkew to the international settlement was now closed. In 1943, with pressure from the Nazis, the Japanese authorities established the designated area for stateless refugees. And all the refugees since 1937 had to move into the designated area within a month. The Japanese sent Kanogoya, a short Napoleonic man, to control movement in and out of the ghetto. All refugees had to wear a badge with their photo and a map showing where and how long they were permitted outside the ghetto. He was the one in charge, calling him King of the Jews. He would stand on his desk and scream at some lucky refugee or jump on their backs and beat them. The Nazis wanted to continue their solution of the Jewish problem and wanted to put all of us on ships, sail them out to the China Sea, then scuttle the ships and drown all of us. Luckily, the Japanese would not agree to this. Money was no longer available from outside sources, and food was very scarce. 42, 43, and 44 were especially hard. The Japanese cut our rations in half, and people were shrinking out of their clothes. They were suffering from dysentery, typhus, beriberi, cholera, and many other diseases. The shortage of food and unsanitary conditions were even worse, with all the other Jews forced to move into Hongkew. Hundreds of old people and children died from starvation and disease. We would spread rice on the windowsill in the sun and pick out the bugs that would come to the surface, then cook the rice. My mother would lick the plate after she fed me and my brother Ralph. Even though U.S. funds were no longer allowed, Lourdes Margolis, with authority from the approval of the JDC for a $180,000 line of credit guaranteed by the JVC to operate for 6 months. She then borrowed money from Chinese local businessmen. All was later repaid after the war. One person can make a difference. On July 17th, 1945, after showering Shanghai with leaflets from the air to warn us we would be bombed, American B-29s flew daily bomb runs over the city. They also accidentally hit the Hongkew area, and 31 refugees were killed, 250 injured, and 700 were left homeless. During one of the bombings, my father picked me up from school with my brother on his shoulders and walked us home. The sky was flame red from all the fires, and the whistling and concussion of bombs exploding was frightening. Because the water table was 6 feet down, there was no bomb shelter. So we hid in the hallways in the Heime. I stuck my head under a chair, hoping the next one was not for us. Everyone feared for their lives. The streets were littered with debris and dead bodies. Rickshaws became ambulances, and the normally white cushions were covered with blood. Trucks loaded with human arms, legs, torsos, and many heads filled the streets. Many of my friends, refugees and children alike, were killed or maimed in those air raids. Many were missing from school the next day. A few days later, the streets became eerily quiet. The Japanese were totally gone. Goya was thrown out of his apartment and seen on the street was badly beaten by the refugees. Because we were all still suffering from malnutrition, we were constantly cold in the winter, and all slept huddled together for warmth. During the day, we would wear as many pieces of clothing as we could. Now the Americans came, and my father got a job at a U.S. Army motor pool, making $60 a month. He was very valuable to the Americans because he spoke English, German, Italian, and of course Chinese. Life became better. We now lived in our own 10-foot by 12-foot room with a sink, a hot plate, and a straw mattress on one bed, which we all slept on. For 4 rooms in the building, there was a concrete room with a cold water shower, not to be used in the winter, wonderful in the summer. There was no flush toilet, only the same wooden buckets we were used to. There was a rusty iron sink outside in the alley to wash clothes. Now we had fresh fish and vegetables and chicken to eat for the first time in my life. The ghetto came to life with many restaurants, coffee shops, nightlife, and clothes to buy. It was odd to see buildings with Chinese signs painted over with German business names. My favorite time was when my father would take me to the motor pool where I could play with the trucks and the jeeps and tanks. My father was teaching Chinese to workers to speak English, and they would come to the house and bring a live chicken as payment. We would kill it in the alley, and I was the one to clean it, but it sure tasted great. Some of the American soldiers were lonely, and they would adopt a refugee family, bringing us scarce food and medicine. For my 7th birthday, Sergeant Larry brought me an apple from the mess hall. I had never seen one before. Of course, there was chocolate for me and Ralph. I'm sure he did many other things, but I was too young to appreciate it. For the next 3 years, we felt relatively safe and thought about making a home in China. Then in 1948, Mao came. We became refugees all over again. Israel sent 3 Greek ships to take people to the promised land. All any Jew would have to do is board the ship. Most of the Jews left China by 1947 for places around the world. But because my brother was born in Shanghai, he was technically a stateless person, so it was not until 1948 before we could leave. We sailed on an American Liberty troop ship, the USS General Meigs, via Hong Kong, Manila, and Hawaii. It was a great adventure for me since I was only 10 years old. I had the first hot shower in my life. The crew of the ship took a liking to me and gave me extra food and time, and I especially enjoyed the radio room and became very friendly with the operator. I was excited to see the ports we stopped at. We took the tram up into the clouds over Hong Kong's Victoria Harbor and could see Macau and the Chinese mainland. Manila Bay in the Philippines was a forest of masts we had to sail through, still there from the war in 1948. The local Jewish community in Hawaii threw a party for us, and someone gave me a set of children's cowboy pistols and holsters. This was the first time in my life I really owned anything. The next day we sailed for America. The woman on the ship taught me how to eat instead of chopsticks. We had escaped Mao by 1 month. This time, the U.S. opened its borders to us. The JDC swept up the post-Holocaust Jews around the world. I'll never forget seeing the Golden Gate Bridge at dawn as we sailed into San Francisco. Shanghai had saved our lives. In 1997, I read that 50% of all the cranes in the world were in Shanghai to serve the buildings boom there. I felt perhaps the history of Hongkew, along with all that I remembered, would be torn down and gone forever. The following year, I, my brother Ralph, and our wives went back to Shanghai, almost 50 years from the day we left for America. I brought copies of my parents' papers, which thankfully my father carried with him on the run. We hired a guide and asked her to drive in the Hongkew area. I asked her to question her elders to find out what the streets of the 1940s are named today so we could recognize addresses. As we got into Hongkew and I started to recognize places, suddenly the Oil Moishe Temple came into view. And I said, I went to Hebrew school there. A 70-year-old man, Mr. Wong, was running it as a Jewish museum, and amazingly, the walls were filled with photos of the Shanghai ghetto. I told him we were there to look at our past, and he asked what my father's name was, and I told him Sigmund Gabler. He looked at the emigrant address book, a listing of all the Jews in the ghetto. He saw that we had lived at 818 Tangshan Road, number 50. And I asked him if he knew where Tangshan Road number 50 was. And Tangshan Road was where he lived, at number 12. Mr. Wong was kind enough to show us his home and took us to number 50. Still gets to me. The nail holes from the mezuzah were still in the door frame that hadn't been painted in 50 years. We were let in and could look through the building. This was a profound moment for me, as it defined who I had become from this experience. I realized I had survived the absolute worst a person could live through and be okay. It also told me why I had been an entrepreneur and hadn't fit well into a corporate structure. What incentive could a corporation offer me that I lived without and had been just fine? and now I understood why I was such an optimist. Mr. Wong showed us around the ghetto, the Kaduri school that Ralph and I had gone to, the hospital where my brother was born, now an apartment building, open air market where we shopped, and the memorial park set aside to commemorate the ghetto. All the smells, the crowded streets, and the strange cacophony of languages were still there, although a much smaller scale than I remembered. This day filled in the gaps from our childhood. Fortunately, Hongkew was still intact and had not been torn down. There aren't many survivors left. At 86, I'm one of the youngest, so by speaking at universities, high schools, synagogues, and various groups like today, I'm educating people so they can be the storytellers of the future. If someone denies the Holocaust, they can say they've met a survivor. I do this to keep the Shanghai history alive and hopefully keep people from becoming complacent and forgetting the Holocaust horrors. I also want to thank my parents for their incredible courage and resilience, and those who helped us all to survive. Thanks for listening.
So much. Thank you so much for sharing your history with us. When did you begin sharing this story?
About 6 or 7 years ago.
Oh, wonderful. And how have you gone all over the United States to speak?
No, as a matter of fact, this is the first time I've gone outside of Minnesota.
Oh, wonderful.
What happened was apparently that there was a woman at the Jewish Community Center in Minneapolis who is in charge of bringing speakers into places. And apparently she met somebody from here, and I don't know who that was at the time.
Wonderful.
But so her name's Susie Greenberg, and she sets up all of it, and she set this up for me.
Terrific. We're so glad you came. I'm excited to be the first. Can you share some about your career and what happened to your family? I'm curious about what happened with your parents too, and then about your career in America post-war.
Well, my parents, if you ever think there isn't a corollary between stress and disease, both my parents died from cancer. Oh. And my father was 49, and my mother was 56. So there wasn't anybody to ask about my past.
Okay.
So I had to kind of put it together over the years.
And they didn't speak about it?
No.
When you, but tell us about your career. You said you're an entrepreneur.
Yeah, I was mostly in the music business. I ran a chain of 40 retail record shops. And from there, I went to being a sales representative for Rickenbacker guitars, and they were played by all the British bands. And then I went to work for Hondo because I spoke German and a little bit of Spanish and that, and I became an international sales rep. And so I sold Hondo guitars, and I set up a distribution network in all over Europe and Asia. And in 81, I sold 91,000 guitars.
Oh my goodness. Wow. That's impressive.
And then I started a company to do audio video systems and in Minneapolis. And we did a lot of the Vikings homes. And so I met some interesting people. And I retired in 2005.
Okay. Did your family settle in Minneapolis, or did you move there?
No, I met my wife in San Antonio, and then we went to New Orleans and lived there for a couple of years because I was a rep, so I could live any place. And we then moved to Minneapolis.
And you have family from San Antonio here with us today,
yes,
right?
My wife is up there, Kathy.
But your kids too, right? Yeah.
No, my grandson Mark is there with his 2 kids.
Ah, wonderful.
So they came up.
Yeah, so glad you're here. So, this question, what was that moment like when you met those 40 family members from your mother's family?
I broke into tears.
Well, we could tell that now. Are you still in contact with them?
Yes, we went back for a reunion, and a few years later, and we went back for my Aunt Ellie's 102nd birthday.
Oh,
And so we've kept in touch. And they came over to visit.
they did.
Yeah, and we took them up to the North Shore and Lake Superior.
Wonderful, wonderful. And Ellie is your mother's sister that was sent to the camp, right?
Right.
But she was just there for a couple of years. She made it through the war.
Survived.
Good, good.
Now, Ellie was, my mother's sisters, they were Christian. So they didn't go to the camps.
But I thought, she was sent to a labor camp because she didn't turn your mother in.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Have you been back to Shanghai since that first visit?
No, 98 was the last time we were there.
It was.
And I plan to go back there because they turned that All Moisha temple into a now pretty nice museum that the Chinese built. And there's a wall with all the refugees' names on it.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
And the living quarters that we have pictures of in the exhibition, were they still there?
Yeah, that's part of the museum.
That's part of the museum.
Yeah,
oh.
they cleaned it up a lot.
Have you stayed in contact with any of your friends, people that you knew in Shanghai?
No, because they all died.
Aw.
Like I said, at 86, I'm like the youngest survivor.
Yeah, yeah. Tell us a little bit about your brother.
My brother Ralph was living in Monterey, and he's now living in Phoenix because his children live there. And so he moved to Phoenix, and I still keep in touch with him.
Good. And you said he was stateless, but he was able to get American citizenship.
Right.
When your family did.
Yeah, we landed here in 48, and 5 years later we became naturalized citizens.
Did you suffer from any lasting impact from the starvation during those years?
No, not really.
No.
I had malaria when I was living in Shanghai, but when we came to the United States, that went away. And other than that, I really didn't have any. I think one of the reasons I'm 86 is that I was subjected to every disease known to mankind. and so
you're tough, huh?
Yeah. I rarely get a cold or anything.
What was it like coming to the United States? What was life in America like, having lived through those conditions? And did the JDC help you set up an apartment and get established?
We landed in San Francisco and stayed in a hotel for a week before we went to Pittsburgh. And I think the JDC had a job for my father there. But the first week I was here in the United States was very memorable because I had my first hamburger. I had a bowl of cereal with cream on it. I discovered donuts. Just all the American foods. And it was like, it was heaven.
Do you have happy memories of your childhood in Shanghai? You saw horrific things and you had disease and hunger, but
I because of the strength of my parents, I really don't have any ugly memories of Shanghai.
Wow.
I was a kid, and I just lived in the moment. You're supposed to be hungry.
Right.
And you're supposed to have tattered clothes, and you're supposed to be cold.
You didn't know any different.
No. Had nothing to compare it to.
And you went to school. Were you able to play games and
we played
sports
soccer.
and soccer?
And when I came to this country, they said, let's play football. And they gave me this oval thing.
Well, you would have been good for it. Did they play soccer? Did you have a chance to play soccer here?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? And you were good, huh?
Yep.
Can you explain why the Chinese allowed Jews to immigrate there? Why was it possible?
Because Shanghai was an open port, because neither the Americans, the British or the French or the Chinese or the Japanese wanted to be involved in any kind of passport control. And we didn't even have passports. And they just let our ships land, and the Chinese accepted us, and we lived among 100,000 Japanese in the Hongkew area, and they just accepted us.
It's an example. If there had been other nations that had accepted refugees, you might have gone somewhere else.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
That's one of the only places you could go.
Everybody around the world closed their doors.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit about the families, the Sassoons and the Coteries, or Kaduri?
The Sassoons and the Kaduris.
Kaduris that
were,
really helped provide resources.
Oh, yeah. They were enormously wealthy. They made all their money in the opium trades in the 1800s, and they were billionaires.
Wow!
At a time when 5 cents would feed a refugee for a day. And Kaduri built the school that I went to, and they bought these battered buildings and quickly built them so we could have a roof over our head.
But they had to leave when, as Mao was coming in too, or as the revolution was occurring too. Where did they?
The Kaduris went to Hong Kong.
Okay.
And the Sassoons also. But they had family all over the world. Like, I think Kaduri had like 7 sons, and he sent them to different countries to start a business.
So this question, the person says this is a toughie. That after such an eventful childhood, what is your deepest conviction about humanity after all you've witnessed?
There's something I wrote, if I can find it. Anyway, I've never felt threatened or treated badly because I was a refugee in Shanghai. The Chinese, who are worse off than we were, just accepted us. And I feel a real strength when when people get bigoted, because bigotry buys you nothing.
Right.
And so I always hope that people will grow up one day and not hate somebody for who they are.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we all hope that. Yeah, thank you. Is there a vibrant survivor community in Minnesota, or are there others that are sharing their stories and
no.
their testimony?
There was a photographer named David Sherman, and he took pictures of all of the Jewish refugees in Minnesota. And there was an exhibit going around with all of our photographs and the stories of our survival, and they're all gone. Wow. For instance, there was a thing that was started in Israel. It was called Witness Theater. And the refugees worked with, and they started it in Israel. They worked with refugees, and then they would do a stage play. The refugees would tell their story, and then the kids would act out the story. And I worked on that with 5 other people, and they're all gone. Oh. So, there aren't any, there's like 3 refugees left in Minnesota. One lives in Duluth, and the other one, she just moved to Florida.
And these are specifically from Shanghai,
yes.
Shanghai refugees.
Yes.
Are there survivors from other parts of Europe, and is there a large survivor community?
I doubt it.
No.
Because most of those people were born in the late 20s, and they'd be over 100. So I doubt that there are any.
Did you experience anti-Semitism in the U.S. after you immigrated?
Not really.
Oh,
I mean, I've seen it all around me, but it's never personally. Okay. When somebody was bigoted towards me, I said, hey, I'm Jewish. They tried to kill me because I was the wrong religion.
Right.
You know?
Did this the story, we call this exhibit Hidden History because it is little known, and there are very few survivors left. What can we do to help make sure that this history is known, and what main lessons should we share with people when talking about the Shanghai ghetto?
Take people like me and keep telling the story.
Yeah. And tell people to come see this exhibition before it leaves on February 16th.
Absolutely.
Right?
It's sobering.
Yeah. But there's some books that have been written about it, but also that you can read and just share this history.
Yes.
And I think, it's over 20,000 Jews survived because they could make it to Shanghai.
Yes.
So it's just a powerful story of having a place to go, a place of refuge is so important.
Yes.
Okay. I think we are down. I think I've asked you all our questions, Manny. I always like to end asking what gives you hope for the future. You're a very hopeful person I can tell by nature, but.
I just hope society grows up.
Yeah. Yeah, hear. Well, with role models like you, hopefully we can get there. Thank you for sharing your story. I'm so glad you and your family survived. Thank you all for being here. We will be open until 9, so if you haven't been through the exhibition, feel free to go in and spend some time there. And again, it's open until February 16th, so if you don't have enough time tonight, come back. It's really wonderful seeing you all, and have a nice evening. Thank you, Manny.